Welcome, everybody here and everybody in the cyberspace, to another episode of Wednesday night. And due to the tragic event that took place and shaken us all in Jerusalem this week, I want to dedicate the class to, firstly, the Kedoshim, the martyrs who literally died while they were praying and worshiping to God in the sacred synagogue in Har Nof, the memory of Rabbi Moshe Twersky, Rabbi Avram Goldberg, Rabbi Aryeh Kopinski, and Rabbi Kalman Levin. And of course, our heart goes out to their families and those that were wounded, the policemen that ended up killing the murderers. Also want to dedicate it lahavdil, in a good sense, to the schus, the merit of Danielle Bas Eleanor. And may this class be part of all the good deeds that Jews all over the world are doing in honor and memory of these people who were so brutally massacred for no other reason than being Jewish. So I decided to dedicate the class not to them, but also the topic. I titled it Blood-Soaked Talit. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. The battle for Jerusalem, which is actually the theme of this week's chapter in the Torah. You know, whenever, in any given situation, Jews always look to the Torah for direction and strength and guidance and so on, especially when something tragic happens and it's completely overwhelming and very difficult to see how we should respond, and besides the anger and the outrage. So the Torah is a good place to look because it helps create a little balance. It gives us context, especially historical context. And not that this consoles us, but sadly this has been a big part of Jewish history, which is why, of course, it's so shocking. Like, I believe the first people to arrive at the scene who are unfortunately accustomed, Atzola and so on, accustomed to situations, literally described a scene that they said you didn't see since the Holocaust, where you saw like Jews lying down killed on the floor in a talit, in the prayer shawl and the tefillin, arm cut off, blood-drenched scissors. You know, these things are, we thought, always elements of the past. So it brings back home to us events that took place back 70 years ago, and the pogroms, and basically our history, a blood-drenched history in Europe, in Eastern Europe, where Jews were simply massacred and killed simply because they were Jews. So it goes without saying that that it's absolutely not even a consideration to have a discussion about this. So any type of justification is obscene. This is not human behavior. And I don't think you need me to say it. I just say it because we live in a crazy world, a confused world, where some media start comparing it and so on and so forth. It's not my theme I want to talk about. We all know that there is a deep antisemitism and bias. I mean, we don't need more than the Holocaust itself. 70 years ago, 6 million Jews were killed, 1.5 million innocent children. And what did the world really do? Not much. Pretty silent. Which is, in some ways, is just as big as the crime itself. So it's not like we're unaccustomed to not having sympathy, and we're not looking for anyone's sympathy. And frankly, all we really need is to have our own strength to know how to forge ahead and proceed and so on. So I want to talk about this. What is the Jewish response? Obviously, we are angry. It makes your blood boil. It makes you, as I said, the fury, the outrage of seeing something like that. But it's interesting that our revenge has never been tit for tat. After World War II, even though history is a witness to every country, every nation, every community that was massacred by another community or nation, as soon as they came to power, their first response was vengeance, literal vengeance. They did exactly to the perpetrators what was done to them. And Jews have never been that way. We did not do that after World War II. No one called for mass bombings of Berlin and Germany and suicide bombings. You don't hear such a call. Even once Israel became a state with an army, it was not part of any plan to go and take vengeance on what happened Even though many of the Nazis are still around, at least they were around, their children, it's not like they disappeared. You're talking about millions of people in the country that they essentially enslaved and murdered Jews. So it wasn't just a few little individuals. The whole country became an institutional barbaric attack on Jews. Everybody was part of it. There were the minorities that should get credit for saving Jews and protecting Jews and harboring them and so on. But it was not the majority. And no way that it could have been done without the cooperation of an entire nation. And yet our vengeance, as every Holocaust survivor will tell you, has always been through building. Holocaust survivors will show you their photo albums of their children and their grandchildren. And they'll say, this is our revenge, this is our vengeance. And when you go to Berlin and you see on Hanukkah, as I once saw, a big menorah in the place in the Brandenburg Gate where Hitler, Yimach Shemay, once stood, rallying his troops, his hundreds and thousands of legions and Jugendrat. That place, right now, there's a Hanukkah menorah there on Hanukkah. And when you see the Christmas tree, you'll see it to the right. And I asked the rabbi there, how did he pull that off? And he says, well, I convinced the guy, the custodian there, that for the etiquette, it looks better to have the menorah in the center and so on. But as joking aside, which is true, happens to be true, so this is the way we look at things. Because you see, we've suffered, but we've never become sufferers. We've not been defined by our experiences, which frankly is itself the greatest psychological lesson in life, because you'll see so many people going to therapy in the Western world deal with this issue all the time, due to their, let's say, dysfunctional homes or different forms of abuse. People carry them and personalize it to the point, and it's understandable, that they begin to identify by their abuse. So people will call themselves victims. So lately it's become less popular to say victim, you say survivors. It's more respectable. But one of the hardest things to do in healing is to separate yourself from your experience. This doesn't mean that you should not have anger and express the pain of suffering, but it's critical never to become that which was done to you. Because if you become it, then you become part of the enemy. You become your own worst enemy. And you become part of the problem. So that's a big part of any healing, is to learn how to separate, this happened to me, this doesn't define me. Which also helps you identify the difference between a perpetrator and a victim. Because very often victims in situations, since they begin to over-identify with their pain, and they start identifying as a person of pain, a sufferer, so then they often blame themselves to some extent. They blame themselves, I must have done this, I must have done that. You find very often children blame themselves for things their parents did, because they cannot tolerate the fact that their parents could have done something like that to them. Because parents are supposed to love you. So what children do is they direct the anger to themselves. And this is a pretty common, it's almost textbook type of reaction, especially a child, impressionable child that doesn't have really resources and tools to distinguish between love and pain. And when someone who's loving you, it hurts you, what you begin to say, something might matter with me, not something the matter with the one that did it. And a big part of healing is to understand the crime was done by the criminal and you're not the criminal. You're not at fault. I know it sounds strange, and hopefully none of you have ever had this experience, but people who've been beat up by alcoholic parents physically, or in other ways been hurt or violated, very often blame themselves. They feel something's the matter with me. Because how could that have been done? I must be so terrible or horrible. And a big part of healing is find out is nothing, that you're not horrible. The person who did it to you is horrible. But in an emotional labyrinth, emotional complex situation, it's very hard to make that distinction. So that the mere fact that the Jewish people as a whole were never identified by their pain, they grew through it and became stronger, but never became people who just sit around with grievances and look for scapegoats. It's not the Jewish way. At the same time, this doesn't mean we ignore it and we're in denial, but we don't allow the events to identify us. What the Nazis did, the Nazis did. This is not going to demoralize our own dignity. It is they that were inhumane. And the same thing that happened this week. This was inhumane people, a culture that has trained its own children to be able to do things like that. You can let it alone. Rest assured, you can tell itself just from that type of behavior. Even if it only happens once, what kind of family you grew up with. That can be even a possibility that two people can just pick themselves up And they worked there. They worked there for many years in the stores in that area. So they weren't strangers. They knew the people who went to synagogue. They were known. Their faces were known. They weren't like suddenly strangers walked in from nowhere. So they were working and getting paid by employers that were Jewish among the Jewish community. And then one day decide this is what they're going to do. And in whatever obscene, distorted way that they were incited, but it's a culture. I don't know if any of you have ever heard the mosque, the imams preaching in the mosques on Friday. It's in Arabic, of course. I don't understand Arabic, but I have made it a point to go listen to translations and read translations of these talks. I just wanted to see, I know I grew up in my community. I heard the rabbi speak. I heard sermons. I heard classes. I went to yeshiva. So I know that you hear what your teachers tell you. Doesn't mean you accept everything, but what do they hear? What are they being told in schools and in mosques every Friday? And you won't believe it. I mean, if one synagogue, one rabbi would make one sermon like that, the whole world, CNN, would go up in arms. Can you imagine a rabbi being inciting? It's not just inciting. They actually call Jews by names every week, citing the Quran, that the Jews are descendants of apes and monkeys, and that wherever the Jew is, behind the rock, behind the tree, find them and kill him. Now, you can say, okay, you know what? Every adult knows. It doesn't mean literal, blah, blah, blah. One second. Let's not kid ourselves. Little children are children. When you hear that as a child, it becomes part of your culture. That doesn't mean everyone's going to do it, but that someone does it shouldn't surprise anyone. I'm shocked that it's not more common, God forbid. But let's be honest. Where did anti-Semitism come from in the first place? Christian anti-Semitism. If children are indoctrinated from the youngest age that Jews are Christ killers, and we killed their God, and we crucified, and we whatever, all the different libels that they pose, which are mostly untrue anyway, because Jews don't crucify, etc., etc., what has it turned out? It turned into killing millions and millions of Jews in the name of an Orthodox Jew called Jesus, which itself is ironic. He himself would have been killed had he been one of the Jews in the communities. So, that's just another twisted irony. But all this was fed, and it's not some type of anomaly where you have a few criminals who happen to go ahead, they're going to go find Jews. There have been studies made that Hitler could never have pulled off what he did, though he did not do it in the name of religion, but he definitely did it under the cover of religion. He used the Christian built-in prejudices, the Catholic prejudices, the German prejudices against Jews, using that in the propaganda, using it in the publications that led up to the Holocaust, was all based on indoctrination and propaganda that allowed the climate. When you get people to think that Jews are vermin and like insects, God forbid, cockroaches or mosquitoes. So what's the big thing? Just like people spray gas on mosquitoes, they spray gas. Once you dehumanize the Jew, that's the way to go. This is what's happening in mosques week after week. Why no one's calling them on it, I have no clue. But this is a fact of life. I don't know if there's a mosque that they don't do it. Especially in the Middle East. I didn't do a study. I'm not going to say every imam in every speech says it, but it's so common that it's, now that I'm talking about it, I'm getting worked up myself. I think I'm going to get the Algemeiner to make a study to try to figure out how many speeches. Let's document it. Let's publicize how many speeches. And I'm not looking here, frankly, to just point fingers. The point is, let's call a spade a spade. Where is the root of such behavior? Now, I say it with a full intensity because when you talk about events like this, obviously we're all very emotional when you see it, and you want to do anything possible to help console or somewhat soothe the pain of children and families and all the people saying, "God," I mean, it's like horrendous. The whole country is probably mortified. Jews everywhere who see it. And, time will pass, and as time passes, what happens usually we go into our own back into our worlds, a little denial, and so on. But I think that as a Jew, we can never forget things like this. But what we do is we translate it into things that are positive. And I'm going to talk about that soon. But I want to go back to the weekly chapter. There's interesting statements in this chapter, and this is a chapter where Yaakov and Esau, these are the twin brothers. The chapter tells us the twin brothers who are born right one after the other. Esau first, then comes Yaakov. And the Torah talks about these alter egos. They were very different. Esau was the warrior, the Torah says. Ishmael he was a hunter. He knew the secrets of hunting. He was a master hunter. And Yaakov was Yoshev Oholim. a person of the book. It literally means the one who dwelled in the tents. But it's referring to, the tents of study. Tents is a tent, T-E-N-T-S. Not tents as in T-E-N-S-E, tents. Ohalim, ohal. So ohal refers to the tents of study, like the academy. In those days it was called, the tents of study is the study of Torah and so on. And that's what Jacob was involved in. That was his... so they were very antithetical personalities. Yet they were twins, both children of Isaac and Jacob. To the point that when they were in the pregnancy, when Rebekah carried them, she was having an extremely unnatural, difficult pregnancy. So she turns to God and asks, what's going on? All in this week's chapter. And without any commentaries, she receives the response from God as follows. You have two nations struggling inside of you. And when one rises, the other one will fall. And when one falls, the other one rises, the first one will fall. So in other words, two struggling nations. So immediately we're told, before they're even born, that these are two archetypes of nations that will later emerge, and they will struggle. Which two nations? Well, of course, Jacob would become the ancestor of the Jewish nation. And who is Esau? So Esau can be, in a more limited sense, you could say is the Roman Christian Western world. But in truth you can say it's the entire non-Jewish world that turned on the Jews. And they too struggle. As the Talmud puts it, when Jerusalem rises, so Adir Belvonon Yippo, Lebanon falls, is referring to the city of that was considered to be a major city, like later would be Athens or Rome. So what was the name of the city? Was the major city in Lebanon? Tyre, I think. Tyre. So Tyre was a major city in that period of time, later years. So whoever controlled Jerusalem, the other party, the Jews were in Jerusalem, so they were reigning. When the Babylonians and later the Romans took control, the Jews were exiled. So they never could coexist. And this struggle is embodied, personified by Jacob and Esau's struggle. So this is what we're told immediately. So whenever you see any type of killing of Jews, any struggle, it goes right back to this week's chapter. So I'm not trying to suggest, God forbid, that this chapter in any way is prophesizing what happened this week. But once it happened, it's hard to ignore the connection directly to the chapter, because the chapter really tells you that Rebekah was told prophetically that these two children of hers would represent the struggle that the Jews would have with the nations that would attack them, basically the children of Esau. Now you could say, well, are the Ishmaelites, the Arabs and the Muslim world children of Esau? First of all, Esau married Ishmael's daughter. So number one is very possible. Number two, Ishmael himself had a struggle with Isaac. And I've talked about this many times, the battles in Abraham's tent, and Abraham's home between Ishmael and Isaac. So however you twist it, the battles are all discussed right there in these chapters. Now the story continues. Abraham with Jacob and Esau, as they grow older, Yigdal and Arim, the children grow up. As I said, they're very different. One becomes a warrior, the other is a gentle scholar. Their physical body makeup is also different. One the Torah describes as red and hairy, like fitting for a warrior, and the other one was very thin, pale and what's it called bare skin. Bare was the word for it? Cholok. How would you define cholok? This is hairy, non-hairy, however that is. Okay. Bare. A-B-A-R-E. Now this is important why I'm mentioning this, because, as you may know, the story unfolds that Esau comes home one day from hunting and he's very thirsty and hungry, and he smells a beautiful broth, a delicious broth that Jacob made, and he says, please give me some. And Jacob says, if you sell me your birthright, because he was born first, Esau, so he sells him his birthright for an azid adoshim, for a broth of beets, a beet broth. Then the story continues that Isaac is getting older, and before he passes away, he tells Esau, go out and bring me a meal, special delicacies that you know I like, and I will give you a blessing. When Rebecca hears that, she goes to Jacob and says, quick, I'm going to prepare a meal that I know your father's favorites, and you will go and bring it, and you'll get the blessing instead of Esau. So he says to his mother Rebecca, Jacob says, but his father was already blind, so he couldn't see, but my father will hear my voice and will touch me. And I'm all bare, and my brother is hairy. He'll right away know it's me. It's Jacob. Instead of getting a blessing, I'll get a curse for trying to fool him. So don't worry. The Torah continues that Rebecca had in her closet, she had some of the garments, the special garments, the begodim hachamudas of Esau. So she took them and took the coats and padded his arms and his neck with the hairy coats of Esau. So now he goes with the food to Isaac, and Isaac says to him, how did you come so quickly? So he said, with God's help, which was already a little giveaway because Esau usually wouldn't use the name God. But anyway, with God's help, fine. So he says, come closer so I can see it's you. He was suspicious. And Jacob comes closer and he touches him. And he touches the hands, and that's what he says. The hands are the hands. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Because the voice of Jacob sounded like Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he ends up blessing him. The end of the story, of course, is what happens next, is that Esau comes back and lets out a terrible wail, and just as Isaac trembles over what happened here. I'm not going to discuss the story with the blessing and so on. It's another discussion. And if you're interested in understanding, how is it possible that a man, a man of integrity that the Torah calls Yeshiv Aholim, should even behave in this way? As Esau says, he cheated me twice. First, he bought my birthright with the broth, and then he went ahead and stole my blessings. So this is a very good question, a very powerful question, and each should be answered. I've discussed this at length. So if you're interested in an answer, you can't find it online, you could search, just look at previous classes of this week's chapter. I've discussed this at length. I just don't want to go there. I've already done that. So what I want to discuss is this expression, the voice is the voice of Jacob and the hands are the hands of Esau. So in a very literal sense, it refers to the two types of personalities. A voice of Torah. Jacob's voice was a gentle voice. It was a voice of Torah, the voice of Jacob. The hands, however, were the hands of a warrior, the aggressive hands of Esau. And this refers often, is used almost like a type of not euphemistic, a type of expression when you talk about massacres or murder. You say Yadayim Yadei Esau, that even though your voice may be nice, but you have blood on your hands. This expression is used in various places that way over the years. It was a way that the Jews would describe a massacre. They would often say, the hands are the hands of Esau. In other words, murderous hands. So it's hard to ignore when things that happened this week, to read this chapter. Here you have Jews are standing in a synagogue saying, Kol Kol Yaakov, the voice of Jacob praying. That's what they were doing, 7 a.m. in the morning in the Har Nof synagogue where it happened. And then the Yadayim Yadei Esau, and the hands of Esau came and cut their lives short. So it's reading the story, both of the struggle between the two nations, as personified by Jacob and Esau, and the actual verse about the hands of Esau, the murderous hands, and the voice of Jacob. You can't help but see the connection. And I think it can help us somewhat, I'm not going to say make sense, because it doesn't make sense, but somewhat get strength and have some direction going forward. So Maimonides writes, very powerful statement, in the laws of tinus, the laws of fasting, in his classic magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, Yad HaChazaka. Maimonides writes like this. He says, when a calamity, I think I actually wrote it, when a calamity strikes a community, we must cry out, examine our lives and correct our ways. And then he continues and says, because if you don't do so, it's considered cruel To say that things just happened, and life is, let's say, just random, and things just happen, he calls achzaris. That's cruel. Touching upon a fundamental principle in Jewish faith, and that is hashgacha pratis, divine providence, which can work both ways, for good or for not. So when something happens, not, God forbid, we're blaming the people it happened to. They were innocent. But we who witnessed it, and we who heard about it, have to look at ourselves, or else it's like saying, why would God allow you to see or hear such a thing? Just what? To just know the news? Just have some information? Just be able to cry about it, have anguish over it? No, it means we can do, and we must do something about it. And this is the basis of all fasting. This is why he begins Hilchos Tainis, the laws of fasting, why we fast on Tisha B'Av, on the 17th of Tammuz, on the 10th of Teves, and the other fasts throughout the year. Why do we fast? Because we are sensitive to the events that took place in history. What events took place? During those times, the destruction of the temple. So even though today you can say, what does the destruction of the temple have to do with us? This was due to the sins or due to the flaws, the faults of people back then. But the fact remains, however, we are aware of it. And even further, the Talmud says that a generation does not rebuild the temple is as if it's destroyed the temple. Therefore, we have to act on it. It itself is a tremendous lesson in life. It means there's no such thing as an accident. And there's no such thing as you seeing something without having some message for you. So to say, when you walk down the street and you see a crime, or you see something be done and you could say, hey, it's not my problem, someone else's problem, this is categorically anti-Jewish thinking. There's a statement when Moses was in Egypt, so he went, and the Torah tells the story that he saw an Egyptian hitting a Jew, striking a Jew. So Moses, it says, Vayifan koi v'koi, he looked around, Vayar ke'ein ish, and he saw there was no person, no one, no man, and he went and killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. So the question, of course, is asked, why did he look around? So the most basic commentary, Rashi, says he looked around because he wanted to make sure nobody was watching. That way, in case he's going to do anything, so he could get away with it. Kill the Egyptian. If there's a lot of Egyptians watching, we'd be in danger. But there's a obvious question on Rashi's commentary. Is that really what Moses was concerned about? He sees a Jew being hit. Why is he suddenly cares about his own skin? You do what you got to do. And it didn't help anyway. If you continue the story, Dasan and Aviram, who were like arch enemies of Moses and in general of the Jews, they were Jewish anti-Semites, they did see it. They ended up seeing it. So Moses missed them. And they actually did inform on him, and he had to escape. That's why he had to escape Egypt and ends up going to Midian, to Yisrael, where he would marry his wife and so on. So why is it? And even if he did look around, why do we have to know about it? We have to know that he looked around. Who really cares? The answer is a very basic answer that I heard once. It was actually Lubavitcher Rebbe told it to my father in explaining the following. Even simpler interpretation than Rashi's, even though Rashi is usually the pshat, the most simple. And that is, Vayifa Moshe Kevukei, Moses looked around if anybody cares. Does anyone care that a Jew is being hit? And he saw in Yarkeinish that nobody cares. Nobody is paying attention. And that's when he acted. As a leader, that's what was Moses. Which is basically the basis, in a sense, what the Rambam writes, as I just quoted. He says that when you see a calamity happen in a community, it's considered cruel if you think nikra nikras, that it just happened and it's not your issue. That's why he says that a person has to be mefashbers, has to examine their own ways, cry out, examine their ways, and see what I can do to be a better person. You can say, why? Just because you heard something happen a few thousand miles away in Har Nof in a synagogue, why do you have to do that? You could cry out. Obviously, it kills us. It kills us all to see it. You can go and try to put pressure on governments and do whatever is possible to make sure it doesn't happen again, or the right action. But why does the Rambam say that you have to look inside yourself? You had nothing to do with it. These were two murderers who took meat cleavers and they did what they did. Why would this consider something we have to do something to repair? Because it's the concept of hashgacha pratis. that you wouldn't be, if you didn't know about it, it's one thing. But if you were shown it and you were told the story, there's no such thing as ignoring a crime. And frankly, the Rambam doesn't even say if it happens to Jews, he says a calamity. The basis of the laws of fasting, why we fast on Tisha B'Av and the 17th of Tammuz and all the fast days, because of the calamities that happened to the Jewish people, even though we may not be directly involved. The same question you could ask on the Yerushalmi that I mentioned before, that a generation that doesn't destroy, that doesn't rebuild the temples as if they destroyed it. Why? What do we have to do with the Jews that lived 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, or 2,500 years ago in Jerusalem when the Babylonians destroyed it? We weren't there. There's no person on earth today that lived then. Okay, maybe reincarnation, a Gilgal, whatever. But we didn't live. Why would we be considered, if you don't rebuild it, it's as if you did it? Why is that like guilt by association simply because we're the children of theirs? No, there's an answer, because there's a reason the temple was destroyed. It was destroyed because of sinas chinam, baseless hatred. Which means that as long there's still baseless hatred, the temple remains destroyed. It's not just an accident. There's a reason for it. So if we're a generation that does not find a way to fix sinas chinam, if we don't find a way to be loving and kind to each other, we become complicit in the crime. Yes, it's far greater standard and responsibility than most would expect. But that's Judaism. The Torah does not let you off the hook. The Torah expects the most of people, not the least. So you want to find excuses, you can find excuses. I have nothing to do with it. It wasn't my fault, someone else. But the Torah standard is something happens in the world, one way or another, you're connected to it. I don't know if you've ever read closely the Haftarah that we read on Yom Kippur, the very moving Haftarah at Mincha, after Yonah. So the story of Jonah, who runs away from God because he doesn't want to go to Nineveh to give them, to warn them about doing tshuva and so on. So he goes on a ship, on a cruise, trying to escape God, which itself begs many questions. He was a prophet, exactly. What does he think? He's going to run away from God? I mean, God created heaven and earth, so suddenly you're going to see. But fine, he decided he's running off, escape. Like many people, they escape their responsibility. They think they can run away. And what happens? A storm begins, and everybody there who's believers, they start throwing lots. Who's at fault? And then Yonah says in the most moving way, because he realized immediately what's happening, and he was not that cruel to make himself completely innocent. He says, it's because of me. This would not happen to you if it was not for me. Which itself, ends up being extremely noble. Because he could have said, what's got to do with me? Throw somebody else overboard. No, he says, it's me. Because he knew as a good Jew that nothing happens without someone at fault. Now there, he happened to be directly at fault. But the point is, it's a statement that when things happen, you have to look at yourself. And it's not about blame. We're not talking here about self-blame and becoming all guilty. It's not about the guilt syndrome. As I mentioned many times, guilt is, I think, a Christian concept, not a Jewish one. I don't even know if there's a Hebrew word for guilt. There's charata, there's chamola, there's regret, there's remorse. But guilt, frankly, unless it motivates you to do something, the guilt that we often associate with Jewish mother's guilt or whatever, Jewish guilt, which is all about demoralizing, is completely not Jewish. In Judaism, we don't believe in things that demoralize you. If it motivates you to become a better person, by all means, that's what all remorse is. That's all sadness. That's all regret. But if it breaks your spirit and you start feeling like a shmata and you're worthless and you're a piece of garbage, how does that exactly is helping anybody? So that's considered to be atzvus. Atzvus is a negative thing, which is depression and anxiety that does not motivate but demoralizes. So when Yonah said that, he wasn't saying it out of demoralization. He was saying it out of dignity. That, a human being is accountable. Something happens, you have to look inside yourself. So no one's suggesting that something that happened this week, what happened, the massacre, is a direct result of your and I crimes. That's not the point here. The point is that it's insensitive to make believe that has nothing to do with you. In other words, it's insensitive to say, I heard something like that, and what's sensitive to do is to look inside ourselves. So it's a thin line. This is not about pointing blame, and it's not about blaming others. It's looking at yourself and saying, if there's pain in this world, I have to look at myself. What can I do to minimize pain in this world? And that's essentially the Jewish approach to things. And that's ultimately the real response. I mentioned before, let's talk psychologically. In psychology, and I mentioned it, I'll just elaborate a bit more. one of the biggest challenges in dealing with people who who are looking for healing in therapy or other type of interventions due to abusive or wounds or scars that we carry from our younger years, the most difficult thing is to separate yourself from your scars. You know, there's an expression in the Talmud that says, "Yitamu chatoim v'lo chait," that the sins should be erased, not the sinners. So it's not just a statement. If you think about it, it's an extremely profound insight into healing. Because when something happens to you, and if it happens more than once, especially when you're a child, and you don't yet have the sophisticated tools, you blame yourself. And you cannot distinguish between the crime, between the scar and yourself. You start thinking that you're damaged goods. This is a common reaction. You know, for someone that's an outsider that never happened to, it sounds almost odd. Why would you think that because somebody hurt you, they're the criminal? Why do you think you're the damaged goods? But that's how it is. That's human nature. There are a lot of different theories given for it, but the one that I've always found to be the most plausible is because for a child, especially for a child, you have to remember, children think very differently than adults. As an adult, and if you have pretty much healthy defense mechanisms and tools, as an adult, someone comes over and insults you, you may not like it, but it's not something you're going to say, hey, you know what, I'm worthless because someone insulted me. Who are they? You have a healthy self-esteem. That's because someone can't just shake you up. Again, I'm talking about if you have a healthy balance. But children don't have that type of perspective. They're still like warm wax, and their personalities are being shaped. So when parents, let's talk about parents, say things that are demeaning, insulting, invalidating of children, it's not just a small little line they're saying, and it just washes over the child. This begins defining the child. And the child begins to think something's the matter with me. Because every time my father or my mother, this is what they say to me. And the child begins to develop a complete distorted view of themselves. Now, if the parents are insecure, rest assured that they're going to project insecurity to their children. Because that's how it works. It's a vicious cycle. Another thing that's argued that's quite amazing is this. Children don't have alternatives. Like you think to yourself, if a child is, let's say, living in and again, I'm using extremes only to make the point. You know, hopefully that we don't have to rely on extremes, but even milder forms. But let's talk an extreme situation. If a child's growing up in a very abusive home, physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, whatever abuse, an alcoholic parent, a Holocaust survivor, whatever, the different forms of abuse that are possible. You know, why doesn't a child just pick themselves up and leave? That's what you would do, right? If you're in a place where people keep hitting you, just leave. A child doesn't have that concept. Because for a child, walking out the door of your house is like walking off the earth. Because they don't understand there's a world out there. And let me just go out. For them, walking out the door is like walking off the earth, literally. So that option doesn't exist. There's no such option. All they have is their home. All they have is their family. Which means they're very vulnerable and completely dependent on parents. So in a good situation, that's great. The parents are loving and nurturing and validating, and they'll help build the child's self-confidence and self-esteem and sense of dignity and so on. But Rahman al-Islam, God forbid, the parents are not healthy. They have the child hostage. The child has nowhere to run. So what does a child do? You have this, for example, same question people ask about. That's why I mentioned abuse. Even without abuse, you have, let's say, parents who divorce. It's common that children blame themselves for their parents' divorce. And a big part of their therapy is to learn that they're not to blame. That they were two adults, and they couldn't work it out. It has nothing to do with you. And you'll hear parents keep telling, even parents who are fighting with each other, they have some measure of respect, they'll tell their children, it has nothing to do with you. Your mommy and tati just couldn't get along, whatever it is. But you say, why do children blame themselves? Why would children blame themselves for their parents' mistakes? The reason given, one of the reasons, and again, these are still theories because nobody can really prove it because we can't get into children's minds and it's hard to really understand them all completely. But this theory, to me, resonates. I'm not sure who said it, but to me it sounds pretty good. Pretty good. I mean, not good, but pretty sound reason. And that is because children worship their parents like God. So when they see their parents do something wrong, they can't accept that the parent is a problem. So what's the second alternative? They're the problem. I must have done something that caused my mommy and tati to not want to be with each other. It's irrational. But it's the child's actually defense mechanism, like a survival instinct, to not want to blame the person that you're supposed to get love from. Because they really so much want love from their parent, they don't want to hear that the parent is flawed. And it's not even a rational process. It's just an instinctive, intuitive thing that a child will do to just separate themselves by saying, you know what, I'm the one. Like they take the blame. I know, again, it's not conscious. That's one of the explanations given. You find another example, and again, I'm using strong examples, and I apologize because I don't like to use, no one should ever hear of real abuse of this nature. But especially in sexual abuse, when there's, God forbid, incestuous form of it, is one of the most horrible types of abuse possible. The violation there, the damage done from that is hard to even describe for those that are familiar with this. And again, I hope nobody's familiar and you don't know no one like this and you should never know. But those that do know that there's a thing called an out-of-body experience. That when certain crimes are perpetrated on someone, and by the way, Holocaust survivors also have described this, that it's so horrendous that in some way you detach from the experience, and it's almost like not happening to you. And children and others who have suffered that way will almost describe it like they were like another party witnessing it. Literally like an out-of-body, like saying, it wasn't me, it was happening to my body, so to speak. It's a certain detachment that at the time actually saves their lives. But later is a very difficult thing to reconnect, so you ultimately develop almost another personality that's watching the abuse, and then there's the personality that endured it. And you have two different personalities in you. And so children like that grow up, ultimately almost have like a split personality, where they have one personality that they show to others, and then there's the other one that is completely locked away. And a big part of the therapy in this case would be, how do you bring them both together and tell the child it's safe now, you can come back, so to speak, and you don't have to feel like, because a child like that develops such reactions that they like these high level of antenna, where everything, they right away react to anything in a very, very sensitive way because everything is dangerous. But without going into further elaboration, the reason I'm saying all of this is because the lessons from the Rambam or from Yoina or from what I'm describing here, being sensitive when something happens, is really a tremendous psychological insight into how we look at life. That when something happens, it's not about you. It's not that you're blaming yourself. It's saying that something happened, and you, because you were witness to it, you have to look inside yourself to see what you can do to repair it. Very different than saying that you're damaged goods and something's the matter with you. That was my main point that I'm leading to. And that is the attitude that when something happens, so there are really three attitudes. You could have something terrible happens, it's not my problem, I'm out of here. Let someone else worry about it. Then there are people who blame themselves for everything. Anything happens, I'm at fault. And then the healthy approach is neither of these two. The healthy approach is you don't ignore, like Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayarki Einish, you look, you see something happen, you have to do something to help out the situation. But you also don't get demoralized. In other words, it's like looking at the enemy and figuring out a way how to fix it. That is the quintessential healthy Jewish approach. So in dealing with healing, just to personalize it again, people who've suffered do one of these two things. They either go in denial, nothing happened, everything's great. Everything's great. Your life isn't working, you can't commit, you have no healthy relationships, you're all kinds of addictions, and life is great. Yeah, because you created your own little facade of escaping the pain of the wounds, and that's it. You have this external, superficial way of sugarcoating everything. And we all know that ultimately has to give, and somewhere it's going to hit. The second approach is, everything is my fault. I'm guilty for everything. I'm worthless. I'm the cause of all the problems and so on. And the third approach is, as the Rambam says, that when a calamity happens, and this is a rule across the board, whether it's individual, in your family, or community, it's axarious, it's cruel to say that mikra nikras, it just happened. You have to say, no, there's a deeper reason. I don't know what it is, and I have to look inside myself. How can I help make my life and this world a better place? It's really the mitzvah of healing, but it should not be confused with blaming yourself. That's not what the Rambam is saying. Some people learn that Hilchos Tainis and they tell me, you see, Judaism is all about blaming yourself. Something happens. I have to have introspection. No. It's introspection that's coming from a healthy person who you see a Holocaust happening, 6 million Jews being killed. You don't just go back to business and work and say, hey, it's not my problem. It's happening on the other side of the Atlantic. You absolutely have to do something about it, physically, spiritually, whatever it may be. So crying out when someone's in pain is what a healthy person does. And also when you're in pain. That's very different than identifying with that. So that's what I go back to, that the healthy Jewish approach to suffering has been, we never became sufferers. I mean, there are people that did, and those people are not healthy. But Jews suffered, but they never looked and said, I am not identified by these wounds and scars that I endured. It's a very, very big difference. So you see an event that happened this week, as I opened up in the beginning of the class. I mean, it makes everybody outraged. It brings back terrible memories of seeing what the Nazis did to Jews in Tefillin, in Talis, prayer books, in synagogues, locking Jews in synagogues and burning them down. I mean, the worst possible things possible. And it's not just then, it was, we go back to the pogroms, the desecration of Jews, especially in times of worship, which everyone sees as being, it's not like you're at war, fine. So war is a certain type of, the rules of war, engagement, people are fighting each other. But it was always known that you leave alone anyone that's in a worshipping type of state, etc., etc. So it all evokes all those feelings. But what ultimately is the Jewish approach is, using the verse in this week's chapters, as I said before, that there are two nations. It was very clear, it was already foretold to Rebecca, that there'd be two nations inside of you, the Mulum Lum Yemetz. When one will rise, the other will fall. And they will fight for Jerusalem. Sur, which is Tyr, is the antithesis, the Umazeh of Yerushalayim. And when one will rise, the other will fall. When the Jews were standing strong during the first temple and the second temple, King David, King Solomon, and the temples, they were in control. When the Babylonians rose, they destroyed Jerusalem. When the Romans rose, they destroyed Jerusalem. And this what happened this week is just part of a whole process that's already going on, I guess, since the birth of Islam, but especially, and then with the Ottoman Empire. Why is there a mosque in the Har HaBayis in the first place? 2. Why they build a mosque there? The Jerusalem isn't even mentioned in the Quran. Now they say it's their second holy site. The holiness is based on what? It's based on because they want to be there. But there's no religious doctrine in Islam that attributes any holiness to Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, they pray towards Mecca, even when they're on the Temple Mount. We pray toward Jerusalem even when we're here. And they're praying to Mecca even when they're in the Temple Mount. So Jerusalem is meaningless to them, to be very honest. The problem is the Jews are there. So one of the symbols of the way Islam, in its conquest of trying to dominate and show that it's the dominant religion, was to build mosques in every religious Christian and Jewish and Christian religious site. Why are they in Bethlehem? Beis Lechem. That's definitely not. It's anything. It's a Christian city due to Yoshke, whatever. Shechem, Hebron. So Hebron, okay, Abraham. But Yitzchak is not their forefather. Jacob is definitely not. So, because this was a symbol of Muslim conquest, that when you go to a place and it shows that God wants you there, you control it. So they build, where they build the temple, the Dome of the Rock? Right around on the Even HaShiyah. That's why it's called the Dome of the Rock. I've never been in there, not supposed to go there, but that's right under that dome that we see, that golden dome is a rock. It's a big rock, there are pictures of it. Some attribute that to the Even HaShiyah. That's where the Holy of Holy was. And that's where they went. Because that's exactly what Rivka was told by God. Lumulem Yemetz, when one rises, the other one will fall. Because in some unconscious way, the nations of the world, and they all stem from Esau, as I mentioned, even though Esau technically you could say is really more ancestor of the Western world, Remi, Magdil, Zuremi, as Rashi says at the end of Vayishlach, and Rome, and that world, but also Esau, remember, marries the daughter of Ishmael. So let's put it this way, the gene pool is quite confusing. So Esau is also connected to the Muslims and the Arabs. In addition to the fact that in general, that's the fact that war is over Jerusalem. And this is what you see, even what's happening now is all about Jerusalem. It all started with the different the upheavals, whatever, the tensions on Temple Mount, which frankly, to put the state, to call a spade, let's say it already since we're saying everything. The 6-day war is when, in a miraculous way, in 6 days, Israel suddenly tripled in size, and they conquered Yerushalayim, the whole old city, the Kaisel Maravi, which was forbidden and Jews were not able to access it since 1948. So 48, 58, 68, 19 years. And it was euphoric time. I was a kid, I remember just generally, I remember it was, but you read the newspaper, you read the accounts, it was unbelievable euphoria. Suddenly, the old city is back in the Jewish hands. The Kaisel Maravi, which was all used as a garbage dump, but it still was standing. And now, so you win a war of that nature, you would think that the Jews would behave like victors. Instead, right as the war was finishing, they already offered the keys back to the mufti, who was like an anti-Semite Nazi, as it is. Why? Because of, I don't know if it's a time to criticize Israeli leaders, but it was due to the regesh nechitut, as they call it, the inferiority complex, a lack of ge'en yankiv. In the laws of war, you never behave if you're a winner like a loser. You definitely don't make the loser feel like they're a winner. And that was a big, big mistakes that were made back then, which today we're paying heavy, heavy prices for, because I don't know if you can even turn the clock back. You won a war. Instead, you made them feel like they're winners, and they control the Temple Mount. Why would they control the Temple Mount? Since what? Israel is Israel. Temple Mount belongs to us historically. It was won by war now. Well, since when are they? Why suddenly? What? And no one even says that. The question is whether Jews should be even allowed to go there. I'm not getting down to the halachas now, whether you could go. I'm talking about controlling it. Who owns it? What are you kidding? This was paid for heavy blood for thousands of years. King David bought it, and King David conquered it. I mean, it's historical facts. No one talks about this because there's the apologetics. Now, I'm not going to suggest that's the direct cause for the massacre, but as soon as you make losers feel like winners, what do you think is going to happen? And now we have to defend ourselves and say, oh, you know what? Okay, it's true, they went too far, they shouldn't have killed people, but you have to understand that they're angry because the Temple Mount is theirs. It's disgusting for me to even repeat this argument because it's so ridiculous. And I think that we all get caught up sometimes in this whole PR propaganda. We've allowed Palestinians to become a name, Palestinian. We've allowed Israeli Jews to be called occupiers and occupied lands. The whole thing is insanity. You start thinking, sometimes I feel like I'm in an insane asylum. You have to remind yourself, because everyone's saying, even the people who are right-wing are like, so to speak, still defensive. What is there to be defensive about? A war was won. You started the war. The 6-day war was a defensive war. It wasn't Israel went on an aggression to go conquer land. They were surrounded, Nasser, the other countries. 1948 was a defensive war. I'm just saying it because I think sometimes you need just to have a voice of sanity in this crazy world. So no one has to preach to us morality and ethics and so on and so forth, especially after what happened this week. So yes, indirectly, you make losers feel like winners, you got yourself big trouble. There's no way that, how to keep it contained now, I mean, if it was up to me, I would do some very radical things. I don't even want to say it online here. I don't mean radical things as in nuking them all. That's not what I meant. I meant to say I would do nothing like the United States does. I don't know if you ever had to deal with getting a green card. I'm an American citizen. I never had this nightmare. But ask people who have to get a green card in this country, what it takes. If you have criminals in a country, this is a country of laws, you're not ready to abide by the laws, either leave, so on. Some have written, and again, this is not politically correct, but I'll say it anyway, some have written in history, when you have enemies in your own territory, and remember, I'm not suggesting 1.5 million Arabs are all enemies, but anyone could be. You have no idea who's who now. What's historically happened when people had enemies in their own territories? You know what happened? Either they were all massacred, like the Indians in the United States, or the Aborigines in Australia, or other countries, or they all were expelled, and they all became refugees. You don't have in history that you can have within your own boundaries an enemy, sworn enemies. So I'm not sure how they're going to deal with this one. That's really the core of the issue here. And again, I'm not saying everybody is, but you don't know who is. But I know what the United States would do if suddenly Muslims started attacking people in churches or in synagogues or in any. The United States would, they would do. So I've always thought maybe we should swap Netanyahu and President Putin for like 6 months that President Putin should run Israel for 6 months. I think we'll solve all our problems. That's what I would suggest if I really had a day here. But that's a little maybe wild idea, but I think it would work. I think the joke goes that when Putin was offered this, he said, well, what's going to happen with Ukraine if I go to Israel? So he's busy with has to do it there. The point is, we definitely need to have some new approaches to this after everything that's going on. But sadly, the way I see it, it's just a bleeding, slow bleeding, and it just doesn't go away. And look, we all know Gaza is just a ticking time bomb. A war, was it one? What kind of one? What are they doing now, you think? They're rebuilding hospitals and shelters. They're busy rebuilding their arsenal. And, I mean, al tiftach peh, but you don't have to be a brilliant rocket scientist to know what's going to come very shortly. And I don't know what's going to happen the next time around. Okay. Another, I don't like to be negative, so I want to go back to what we can do, because, we're not politicians and able to have influence on the political front, the diplomatic front, and neither are we soldiers and so on. But on the other hand, excuse me, we are soldiers, because we're tzivus Hashem, we're told, and we have part of the battle has to be fought. And what Jews do in times like this is they reinforce and strengthen exactly the places where the enemy strikes. The enemy struck in a synagogue. Every synagogue is a migdash ma'at, is like a small temple, a small sanctuary, and struck in Yerushalayim. So what do we do when Yerushalayim is struck? We rebuild Yerushalayim. Because as I just said, the secret is in this week's Parsha. Rivka is told the secret, and then later Yaakov is told the secret in the blessings, and even Esau is told the secret. V'rav Yavid Soyer, what happens? That this nation will dominate over this one. For Jews to be strong, they have to build Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim means physically build it and spiritually build it. That is our response. And the more you attack it, the more you attack it, the stronger we build it. We build more shuls, you get more Jews to go to shuls, you build Yerushalayim physically and spiritually. That's how we do it. That's our response. Now, obviously, we do everything possible militarily, just like if you need to go to a doctor, you do what you need to do from a physical, medical, and military situation. But we're talking about in the broad context of things. What did Jews do in history? That's what they did. They built. Where does the concept of a shul come from in general? Do you know? Yecheskel, the prophet, asks God, what's going to happen once the temple will be destroyed? Where will the Jews communicate with you? How will they commune? So Eibishter says, migdash ma'at, that you tell them that wherever they go in this world, they should build small shuls, small sanctuaries, migdash ma'at, small sanctuaries. That's where a shul comes from. Many people don't even think they know about it. It's a pasuk. Migdash ma'at, that build them until Mashiach comes, build small migdashes, small sacred places, and Beis HaKnesses, Beis HaMedrash, and I will come and rest there like I rest in the Beis HaMikdash. And then the Gemara even says that when Mashiach comes, all the synagogues from all over the world will return to Eretz Yisrael and join together. Whether that means physical, spiritual, however you explain it, but that's what it says. So here is a shul in Yerushalayim, and that's how we respond. We respond by strengthening that which the enemy attacks. And so that's our vengeance. Obviously, again, I don't want to minimize the need to do whatever has to be done from a military end of view and definitely to protect the future. But that's how we do it. So we are also soldiers. And to be passive, even here in New York, in the United States, and say, you know what, I feel bad, I'll say a kapitel tilim, I'll cry, I'll watch it online, the Hespedim, whatever, that's not enough. The Rambam makes it very clear, Yefashvish b'maisav, a person has to look at themselves, and has to rebuild Yerushalayim inside them, inside their communities. And if anything, we have to redouble and triple our spiritual commitment to Judaism. The second thing Jews do in times like this is they gather the children. You see Mordechai, when the time of Tzara, when it was the time when Achashverosh and Haman had the decree, so Esther told him, gather the Knes, Leich Knes Kol HaYehudim, but especially the children, and they said different psukim, because it says in the pasuk, in Tehillim, Mepi'elim v'yenkim yisadet ha'oiz, lahashbis oiv misnakim, that from the mouths of babes and sucklings will come, Yisadet ha'oiz will be the foundation of Torah. Ta'oiz is Torah. Lahashbis oiv u'misnakim, which means to silence or to eliminate the enemy. It's a clear pasuk, which is the second thing we do. Anyone here that has children, That's what you should do. This Shabbos, maybe it doesn't have to be Shabbos, in the morning and then evening. It's also a good lesson for children. Tell them something tragic happened. They may have heard about it. You don't have to obviously go into the gory details. But we as Jews are committed, and we're going to do something special. We'll say an extra pasuk. We'll say an extra kapitel. I mean, these attitudes are not just religious responses. They're also psychologically healthy responses. Because we're not victims. We do things. Now, yeah, you could say, okay, what's going to help my pasuk? Well, you know something? Who knows? Jews are here all these thousands of years not because we were the strongest army. It's because we have spiritual strength. We survived the Egyptians. We survived them all. We'll survive. We survived the Christians and the Romans and the Babylonians, and we'll survive the Muslims too and the Arabs. So what we do is what Jews have always done. We connect to the spiritual underpinnings and foundations. And our children, of course, are a critical component. What's the story there? The story about Achiz. The king Achiz was one of the cruel, wicked Jewish kings. And what did he do? What do you think he did? He closed down the yeshivas. Because he says, Giyadim nasat tiyashim. If you want to stop Jews from proliferating, this was a Jewish king, Jewish anti-Semite. If you want Jews to stop proliferating, you have to close down Giyadim, what did I say? Giyadim nasat tiyashim. If you want the adults not to grow into adults, you have to kill the children. So he said, let's close the yeshivas. That way, this is a medrash. That way, the children will not have a place to go study, and they won't know anything about Judaism, and Jews will die out. That was what he decreed. So obviously, Mordechai and everyone that ever came in a time of Tzara, that's what they did. They gathered the children, because the children are our future. So that's suggestion number 2. So firstly, in addition to our own rebuilding Yerushalayim and our own commitments, the second thing is what we do is we get our children stronger. And remember, they'll remember this. Children, when they grow older, they'll remember that when something happened, my parents didn't just sit by and did nothing. We weren't silent. I remember clearly, you'll see children remember things. And they'll remember that our parents gathered us and said we have to do something, what we can do in this little part of the world. Even as children, you could say a bracha, a tefillah. Utsa eitzav v'sufer, davru davru layakum ki manu keil. That when there's all kinds of eitzes, of enemies, plotting and conspiring, we do our part by adding in Torah and mitzvahs and tefillahs and so on. And, of course, finally, the third thing, anything we can do to influence others. We live in a world, unfortunately, that most Jews don't even know what a shul is. Now they know when they hear this news that in the shul people were killed. But most don't know what a shul is, and let alone step in. Now, I know there are many shuls that none of us are really comfortable stepping in either. But you know what? Those of us that have a healthy relationship with Yiddishkeit, and I hope everybody has some healthy, we have responsibility. You go to work, you meet other Jews, you're not supposed to just do business with them. Why not talk to them? Say, this massacre happened. I feel that we have to do something as Jews, something a little stronger, committing to Jew. Invite them for a Shabbos, invite them for a prayer, I don't know. Find some warm and kind way to strengthen Avos Yisrael. Because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, the temple is destroyed because of sinas chinam. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody has sinas chinam, but avos chinam we definitely don't have. Avos chinam means you love also people that are not just grew up like you and dressed like you and go to the same shul and gossip in your language. It means people who are Jews who may not, in their own way, tinik shenishbo, whatever it is, are not familiar. So what better time to unite with Jews than a time when Jews are being attacked? That's when we need the atem netzavim hayem kulchem. The Medrash says, he compares it to stalks of straw. One stalk is very weak. But when you put a whole bunch of straw together, nobody can destroy it. Because once it's a rope that's not made up of one strand, it gets stronger. So how do you strengthen? We strengthen by gathering with each other. I don't say lahavdil, but I'll use an example. I don't know if any of you saw the March of the Penguins. This was a famous movie a few years ago, G-rated, actually. It was actually a story, the real story of penguins in Antarctica and the South Pole. And it's fascinating to see the Eibishter created in the Flois HaBeira. You see penguins and how the Mesiras Nefesh, the dedication, the commitment they have. Did you see it? Anybody saw it here? Does anybody even know what a movie is? Well, if you don't have to see it. I'm not saying you have to see it, but it's a very beautiful way you see how the penguins the sacrifices they go for their children, number one. But the most important, one of the things that struck me was how they, it's freezing cold. You're talking about sub-zero, sub minus 70, minus 90. I know, horrible cold, terribly cold there. And how they all huddle up together, and they constantly change. That the penguins on the outside keep moving in the inside, and then the ones on the inside move to the outside. That way, they manage through the winter. And you see, it's only through their achdus, through their unity, and through their sacrifice. No one says, you know what, I'm inside, aniyas nafshi salty, tzadik and pelts. I'm in the inside, let someone else stand on the outside. They're all alternating all the time. They're constantly moving. They're all packed together. I'm talking about especially in the very, very cold. It's amazing to see how they just naturally, the Gemara says that if we didn't have the Torah, we'd learn tznius, modesty from a cat, and other features from other animals, even unkosher animals. So there's no question you can learn things from every creature. And I just found that to be amazing. I also saw, I don't know if you ever see how birds fly. Like, it's pretty amazing. You see they all fly and they turn together. Like, you wonder, how do they know how to turn like that? And when geese fly, they fly in a V formation. And there's actually some technologies, every technology is really copying nature. Camera copies the eye, an airplane copies a bird. So all these things are studies of studying animals and creatures. You actually learn technology. So there's technologies based on the V formation of geese flying. When they fly like a V, meaning that there's like a bird in the front and then the rest of them spread out like that, like a V. And they discover why. Because that way, the birds behind the earlier birds carry themselves on the wind generated by the wings of the birds before them. So they maximize their ability to fly with less energy invested. I mean, these lessons are lessons, obviously, of how nature works in such a symbiotic way. It's human beings are the ones that screw things up because everybody is self-contained and everybody is self-interest, and we lose sometimes that sense of connection. So, Rachmana litzlan, we shouldn't have to need tragedies to unite us. But unfortunately, that's sometimes the times that we're motivated to do so. So when you see a Jew attacked, let's be very honest. Everyone's sitting in this room right now. I don't know about the women. I don't know if the women went to daven 7 o'clock in the morning. But the men for sure. It could have been you. It could have been me. You happened to be there and decided to go daven that morning in that shul. Could have been any shul. So to say that it's not my problem, not exactly really a responsible statement. They were attacked because they were Jews, not because of their names, and not because of their businesses, and not because of any personal agenda. They didn't even know. They were attacked because they were Jews davening. So we have to feel, it's like, it's like I was there. Not to blame ourselves, that's not the point. The point is the achdus part. So these are the 3 suggestions I'm making here, and I'm sure you can come up with others. Jews' approach to everything is always building, never being insensitive to the situation, same time not blaming yourself, but looking inside yourself, what could I do to make this stronger? Yerushalayim needs to be strengthened. And I mean again, begashmis and beruchnis, the walls of it have to be strengthened. And I have no doubt when Yerushalayim shalmayla, which means the spiritual side of Yerushalayim is stronger, the physical side also becomes stronger. When Jews have more pride, and they feel, as I said before, this is our land, this is our city, this is our holy city from the beginning of time, that also gives you physical strength and weakens the enemy. So strengthening that is strengthening it in Yiddishkeit, which is the Yerushalayim within each of us. Yerushalayim comes from the word Yireh Shalom, which means complete awe or complete fear, but fear is a negative connotation, so complete awe. Yireh, like Yireh Shamayim, Yireh Shalom. That's where the word comes from. And strengthening our shuls, strengthening our commitment to that. The second thing I said was our children, Mepi'elim v'yankim, and finally the third thing is Avos Yisrael, connecting and strengthening our connection with others. This is the quintessential Jewish approach you'll see throughout history. That's what every Jewish good leader always did. Moshe Rabbeinu, I mentioned Yena, I mentioned Mordechai, everyone. Whenever there was a challenge, Esau or Yaakov, this is how they did it. They gathered together, they strengthened themselves. And I think we it's not about going and looking for our rabbis and leaders. Obviously, as usual, conspicuous silence from anyone that's supposed to be a leader. We have no leaders, let's be honest. Maybe people cry out, it's horrible, it's terrible. I'm sure everybody feels the horror of what happened. But leaders that show direction and call and give you courage and feel that we can do something. We break into factions and arguments and so on and so forth. It's like ridiculous almost, more than ridiculous. Imagine in the middle of a war when you have enemies attacking you and people start arguing, 1 second, my shit is this and your shit is that. My friend, we're in war here. They're attacking Jews, whoever they are. It doesn't matter whether they're modern Orthodox, Hasidic, or Litvish, or so on. Hitler, when he went to a city, you think he was looking just for Misnagdim Chassidim? He was looking for everybody. It didn't really make a difference whether they were secular or not secular. So, God forbid, do we have to wait for an enemy to unite us like that? Anyway, these are my sentiments and thoughts. Since I have the floor, I say what I want to say, uncensored, and everybody can take, everybody can take it or leave it, frankly. So we live in a democracy, but I feel that to me this is the sound approach, how we look at these things. I feel empowered when I feel that I can do something positive. Again, it's not necessarily direct, but today we have the concept of a butterfly effect. In science, they know today that a butterfly flaps its wings in Kansas, and it can create a typhoon in Singapore. Because in science, things are cumulative. A small shift in one place can create a major tidal wave in another. That's how it works. Nothing begins with a major storm. Did you ever see how hurricanes form in the East Atlantic? They're nothing in the beginning. It's a wind. And then another wind, and suddenly captures, and suddenly it turns into a hurricane. It's always that way. Tsunamis work that way. Everything works that way. I remember once traveling, I was in northern Minnesota. Actually, I was in Canada. No. I was in Canada by the northern Minnesota border. I'm speaking there, and the guy, my host, says, after that, in the morning before you go to the airport back, I want to take you let's drive somewhere. I want to show you something interesting. And we drive like 20 minutes, 25 minutes. It takes me literally to the border between northern Minnesota and Canada. It's like a place completely desolate, no one's there. We get out of the car. He takes me over and he shows me a little trickle of water, literally like a faucet, like one little trickle. And he says, watch this. And he puts his foot there. He had a boot, and it was like he stops the water from flowing. So I said, so? He says, well, if I keep my foot here and we build a dam, the Mississippi will dry up in around 50 years. This is where the Mississippi River begins. It's a trickle of water coming out of one little, like a ground, part of like a cave there. A trickle of water from somewhere, some spring. And this water trickles down the border, starts spreading, bigger, and it's the Mississippi River. If you ever see the Mississippi River, it's a serious river. He said to me, it's just interesting. Sometimes you don't know where things begin. They could be very little thing, and then suddenly they turn into the biggest monster. In a good way, and God forbid in a negative way. We see this always. How many things, had we nipped it in the bud, the problem would have gone away. How many illnesses could be prevented? So in the good, meruba midateva, that good things, a good act. The Rambam also says this. It says, Le'elam yira atzmei ki'ilu chetzi zakai chetzi chayav. You should always look at yourself and the world as if it's half worthy and half guilty. So therefore, on a scale, it's 50-50. They balance each other out. So even though there's 7 billion people on the planet, but if everything is 50-50, so it's equal. And he says, one good thought, one good word, one good action tips the scale. Now, when he wrote it over 1,000 years ago, but from a scientific point of view, it's absolutely the case today. It's not about quantity. It's not about size. One shift, one dot in a program, a computer program of millions of lines of code changes everything. So it's not. So we see that an action, even though you may think it's a small little action in your little home with your children or yourself, no, everything creates a ripple effect. And especially when you're familiar with the Kabbalistic and Hasidic interpretations, that spiritual impact is invisible to the eye. But a good deed releases energy, and energy is very powerful. The fact that you don't see it doesn't mean anything. You know what nuclear energy is generated from? Everyone thinks it's generated from big machines. Nuclear fusion can take the strand of a hair, one hair, and if you know how to speed up the subatomic particles or heat it up, you can create what's either called fusion or fission, and you can release an unbelievable energy that can destroy half the world. That's what was discovered in the nuclear the revolution, which is the unbelievable amount of energy in the smallest piece of matter. However, when it's stable, when things are the temperature is stable and the speed is stable, you don't see it. But when you accelerate it and you know how to create that fusion, which is done, this is the whole process that we read about Iran, uranium enrichment, because uranium is a metal that is more conducive and much easier to create this fusion. But it takes years. But once you do it, you can actually release an unbelievable amount of energy. Now, anyone that learned Yiddishkeit or learned especially Kabbalah and Chassidus knows this as a fact all the time. That matter is energy and just locked and trapped inside. You see it with people also. You could see a mild-mannered person, you tick them off, and suddenly you see such energy you couldn't believe it. Or when we're in danger or crisis, you suddenly see an adrenaline flow, and we end up doing things we never could believe we could do. Where does all that energy come from? It's because energy is invisible to the naked eye, but it lies there dormant, and it's like a potential power waiting to be released. The computer world has now tapped into that energy. You have a mobile phone. You never would have imagined, 1950, to have the power that one mobile phone has. You need to have 10 city blocks to be able to generate that. Because we've discovered how in the microchip, in the smallest piece of matter, you can create tremendous amount of data and information and all the forces. So we see it all day. So no one should think that my one act can't change the world. It could change the world. It's just we've been programmed to think that you're a nobody, and who cares about your little act? What difference does it make? It makes a difference. And even if and the Rambam said it clearly, one act tips the entire scale. So, in the final analysis, as we read Parshat Teilos, and sadly we hear about how one nation rises and the other one gets hurt, and it's all about Jerusalem. It's about the battle of Yerushalayim from Esau and Yaakov and Ishmael, and we see it in how it played itself out in history. But at the end of the day, we're given the bracha. Yitzchak told Yaakov that you will reign over your brother. Even though the bracha initially was supposed to be to Esau, as I said, I'm not getting into the discussion how that man of integrity could have just stolen it like that. That's another discussion. But the bottom line is we have these blessings. And look at the fact of life. We are here today. Esau's grandchildren are also here, but no one knows exactly who they are. We have a yichus that goes straight generation, Ishmael, generation, straight back to Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, to these great people. And we have the two events that happened. The Kel Yankov, that morning in the shul, was defiled by... Anyway, it's all right. So, must be Skype or something. Okay. Maybe I said something, maybe they're coming after me. So the Kel Yankov was defiled by Yadayim Yadei Esau. So I know in the Pasuk it says it all about Yaakov himself. That when Yitzchak touched him, he said, HaKel Yankov of Yadayim Yadei Esau. But still it's been used in Sfarim and in many ways sometimes to refer to the Kel Torah, the Kel Tefillah, and on the other extreme, you have the Yadayim Yadei Esau. And we saw it tragically unfold in this week's chapter. In this week's event. So God should help us all that if we strengthen the Kel Yankov, we strengthen the voice of Torah and Tefillah in our lives, it will weaken the Yadayim Yadei Esau, that Eitzav Sufa, that the plots should be Lechatchila Sufa, should be initially eliminated, and initially how do you say lechatchila in English? Should be preempted. Just like we say Tarim Yikro V'Aniyena before we even call out, God answers. So just by doing our Kel Yankov, that will automatically eliminate and destroy any type of plots and conspiracies out there. And we should only know of simchas. But we should remember we are all one nation, and no matter where we live in this world, we're part of one organism. And when you strengthen one part of a body, the rest of the body gets stronger. The Yerushalmi says it's like different organs and limbs on the human body. That's what Avis Yisrael is, and left arm or right arm. So something happens to the left toe can strengthen or weaken the rest of the body. And we should never forget that. Again, we should only know for simchas, and hopefully we could all do our part. And again, I want to dedicate it The class is in schus of Daniel Bas Eleanor, but also in memory of the Kadeshim, Rabbi Moshe Twersky, Rabbi Avram Goldberg, Rabbi Aryeh Kapinski, and Rabbi Kalman Levin. Hashem Yinkum Domam, and their family should be consoled. It's not going to be that easy, but the Jewish nation should be consoled. And when we strengthen our commitment to what they were committed to, which is davening, that's what they did when this happened. So we strengthen that. We strengthen our commitments in some way. I can't say it redeems their deaths, but at least it's not completely in vain, and we somewhat honor them in that way. And we should be zeicha. We pray that we should all be reunited with all our loved ones. And finally, should be Shalom al Yisrael in the true sense of the word. And the Jews do their part. I have no doubt if we're strong and we do whatever we have to do, it'll eliminate the challenges of the enemies. And we have to do everything on every possible end, like Yaakov also teaches us in a few chapters from now, when he reconfronts, when he reunites with Esau, he prepared tefillah, a prayer, doron, a gift to appease him, a bribe, and melchomo. You have to do that if you're necessary. In that case, Yaakov didn't need the melchomo, the war. But if you need to do that, so we have to be prudent and prepare on all ends. And hopefully we don't need to have the last one. We could just do it with others. And above all, with our tefillah and our prayers, our kel yankov, eliminate all the negative things. We should only have simchas and we should only talk about good things. But I feel blessed and honored to be able to use this platform to honor these losses. And as I said, we should only have simchas and should be a pleasant week. If anybody has anything that they may need, I mean, just like I just suggested things, obviously I myself will live up to what I'm suggesting. If anybody has any needs that we can help with, whether it's in any of the areas that I described or other things, please don't hesitate to call on me or my office, Meaningful Life Center. And we will have a class next Wednesday, as well as Philip giving his Thursday class tomorrow evening. And if anybody wants to dedicate any future Torah classes, you can do it online or let me know or call my office. And that will be it for this coming week. Everybody should have a very pleasant and good Tzlachadika week. Thank you.